Pneumatica Book 1 by Aaron Wilburn and Aaron Knight. The Frank Cole Sequence. Chapter 2. Section 3. Present day. Her room was dark, but it wasn't just that the lights were low. There was an oppressive heaviness in the room, and the lights that did show didn't cut through the shadows. Sandra was just as striking in the privacy of her room as she was in the meta, only she wasn't working so hard to hide her feelings. Frank saw the agony of worry and weariness in her expression, but he had to force his perceptions to their sharpest in order to do so. The heavy ambient darkness seemed to obscure her face even more distinctly than it did the rest of the room. That added up with what he now knew. He supposed he had been looking back to see if Sandra had ulterior motives from the beginning. If he were only judging from the look on her face, he would have guessed she was being manipulated as much as he had been. Frank unclenched the fist that grasped the ring and let the vision go. He slid the tiny, delicate object back into the pocket of his coat and stood, then picked up the shades from where he had set them aside. Out of habit, he then checked them over to make sure they still functioned. Especially when he had first really starting exploring his abilities, he had often found any unshielded items completely burned out after one of his visions. He had run up a bit of a reputation for having to replace tech more often than most. "Once more unto the breach," Frank said, putting the shades back on. "Resume play." 6 months ago. It was with some measure of consternation that I found out where Sandra actually lived. Biodyne, like most of the Megacorps and their subsidiaries, had 3 or 4 headquarters scattered around the world. One of Damutech's most powerful subsidiaries, and the company most people envision when they think of Damutech's services, Biodyne had headquarters in Asunción, Astana, and Dallas. The Dallas metropolitan area had fashioned itself into the new heart of the region after most of the Texas coast was lost to flood and storm, and Austin was annihilated in the Third War. It had long been a sprawling metroplex, and from what Pops had told me and what I had read since, it had once been 2 major cities, with numerous other smaller cities surrounding it. These days it was all just Dallas, with several major arteries connecting every part of it with the other. It existed as a wider arc of poverty-ridden warrens to the south, including all of old downtown, with a perfectly circular raised globe hollowed out in the north, almost like its own small arcology. The wealthy there certainly acted like it. Even so, there was a feel about Dallas that made it different than other cities and arcologies that I had been to. The divide was there, but there was still a pride to the whole city. People showed their Dallas residents like a badge of honor, and there were places within the historic Arts District area that, despite its current state of disrepair, still drew the upper crust. An attempt at mitigating the Texas heat had once been made by creating a system of underground walkways that connected all of old downtown. Despite all the money poured into it, that network had been mostly abandoned long before the Third War. However, any space within a thriving metropolitan area was at a premium, so some enterprising souls in North Dallas had gobbled up the rights to all of that empty space. They reinforced its crumbling supports, reclaimed business areas that had already been built, and created new living spaces, all underground, and with easy access to the rest of old downtown. There were bridge communities living on the skeletal remains of once graceful skyways. Many of the skyscrapers that were still structurally sound had been reworked for living as well, since the businesses that had once found their homes there had either ceased to exist or moved to North Dallas. The result was that even old Dallas existed on multiple levels. I lived underneath an old church, All Saints, on South Hervé. Not many people stayed interested in the old place after the Universal Transcendental Congregation gobbled up most of the world's religions. Almost no one physically went to church anywhere anymore, even if most people paid lip service to the tenets of the UTC. So the rugged square building, damaged through neglect and the nasty fighting that had occurred even here during the war, had been left to fall apart. I wasn't most people. David Cole, my grandfather, had shown me what the world had once been like. He taught me from old books and took me to the old places all over the planet. I had chosen my own faith long ago, and it had much more to do with self-sacrifice and service than with unfettered hedonism.